Welcome, everyone. This is Oladosu Adenike, and today we have a very important guest, Friederike Otto. She's a senior lecturer at Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, Imperial College London. And she'll be here to share more light on the 28th report, the report that will be released this month, February 28th, that talks more on climate adaptation. In previous reports, she has been involved in the latest released last year report, 2021. And she's going to share more light about this report, what it means for African like me. You know, in climate change in Africa, it's how we can adapt to all of these changes, of which some of these changes we might not be able to adapt to it. But for some that we could adapt to, we will try our best to see how we can fit in all of these challenges, all of these changes into the current crisis, so that we don't get to bear the burden of the climate change crisis anymore. So she's going to be telling us briefly about what who she is, where she is from, and the rest. So up to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as you said, I'm Friederike Otto. I'm at Imperial College in London, and I work on extreme weather events and how climate change affects extreme weather events. And of course, extreme weather events are one of the changing likelihood and intensity of extreme weather events are one of the main factors how climate change manifests for all of us. But of course, while the climate is changing around the globe, who is paying the highest price for these changes are always those most vulnerable in every society, but also globally. And so therefore, what this upcoming report that will be published on Monday, the 28th, is particularly focusing on is the vulnerability and who are the different people and what are these different vulnerabilities that people have to deal with who are also feeling the impacts of human-caused climate change.
Thank you so much. I know you are not new to this report by IPCC. And so the first question I'm going to ask, we know climate change is a global reality, and Africa is bearing the brunt, and every part of the world is bearing the brunt of the climate change crisis in different dimensions. So what does it present, this report? So you talk about vulnerability, you also talk about adaptation, about these changes. What are those vulnerability that we'll see, maybe existing or new vulnerabilities? Because as climate change lingers or progress, the vulnerability is going to increase. We might have new forms of vulnerability. So what do we expect from this next report in terms of vulnerability of Africa to these changes?
So what this report, what in this report is different to previous reports is that it has it brings together much more than previous reports, the scientific evidence of what is actually changing and where with these different dimensions of vulnerability. And so there are different chapters on each continent. So there is a specific chapter on Africa, but then there are also specific chapters on particular dimensions of vulnerability. So there is a chapter on health. Is a chapter particularly on ecosystems, so that these that depending on who you are, one can look at what is really the main focus of my interests, and where also, if you're a decision maker, where can we make a difference? And so the report, as you've said, shows that we cannot adapt to everything. Losses and damages because of climate change have already happened, and they are also particularly linked to extreme events. So one of the most underestimated impacts of climate change that have already been happening in Africa for many decades are heat waves. So heat waves are where climate change is an absolute game changer. So hot extremes have become much more frequent and much hotter than they would have been without climate change. And they lead to increased mortality. So many people have died from heat that would not have died if it wasn't for human-caused climate change. But particularly in Africa, there's no early warning of heat waves. So there's no recording of who are the people who are particularly vulnerable. And we know that it's always the people who are suffering most in heat waves are those who have to work outdoors, are those who live in poorly insulated housing, often in informal settlements. And those are often also the people who have the least information about how they can save themselves from these heat effects. So that's one really important, especially important dimension for Africa, because while people often think about droughts when they talk about climate change, it's actually heat waves where climate change is playing a much bigger role. But the people who are vulnerable are the same who are also vulnerable to other extreme events.
Okay, thank you so much. So on a general scale, like what is this report? What is the key takeaway from this report, or what is the warning to everyone for us to take the necessary action? Because this is a report that we get to see every time, and what will make this report to be different for every other report, so that, you know, we have been hearing about this report. The last one that was released, we saw that it was a red alert and the rest. So what key elements can we take from this report for leaders to act like never before? Okay, so is it that talks about Africa, about Asia, and about, just on a global scale? What is the key report? What is the warning talking about? What do we need to do differently that we are not doing?
So in the past, and also in most discussions that we're having on climate change, it's talked about as a physical issue. And often the solutions are talked about in technical terms. But I think what this report and what we know now shows very clearly is that we will not be able to deal with this climate crisis if we do not invest much, much, much more in governance and education. So what enables us and what enables our societies to become more resilient and to decrease our vulnerability is good governance and education. Education in particular also of girls, education of other marginalized groups, because these groups are those who are most vulnerable and who are at the moment paying the highest price for climate change. And we need to address all areas of inequity if we want to adapt to climate change and if we want to be able to deal with climate change. Climate change is not primarily a physical crisis, it's a justice and equity crisis. And that becomes particularly evident in Africa. And this is what this report is highlighting.
Yeah, very well. I agree with you, because I believe that you will not be able to solve a problem if you don't know that it exists at first place. Because I know climate change exists and it's a big problem. So I try to reach out, I try to contribute, I try to see ways at which we could make our leaders to act and the rest. So very well, you make that point well known. And just to ask another leading question, that I heard about the fact that there will be a lot of loss and damage. So how do we adapt to all of this? What is the policymakers' document talking about adaptation to all of this crisis? Because if we don't talk about it, it might overwhelm all our capacity, because in Africa, we need more capacity to build on. We need more finance, because I believe that without finance, loss and damage becomes inevitable. Like, what is the policymakers' document or part trying to talk about in these areas?
Yeah, so you've said it very well. Finance is one key enabling factor to allow societies to adapt to climate change. Without access to finance, you can't adapt, because then you can't invest in better housing, in better healthcare, in better education. That none of that works without finance. And and also other enabling factors are access to education, participation in research, because it's still the case, and that was particularly obvious also in the previous IPCC report on the physical science basis, where I was an author, that we have so much more information on climate change in Europe and the US compared to Africa or Asia. So there is still a huge need to increase the capacity or the participation of African scholars and African scientists in the scientific process, so that that also solutions are researched from within the African continent. And also that is also, of course, linked to finance in many ways. So I think that at the last COP in Glasgow, loss and damage was not was not supported by financial aids, but it was still continued to be just talked about without any financial measures. And also the failure of the COP and of the developed countries to provide the promised 100 billion a year for adaptation, that this is still not happening, shows that the leaders of this world have not understood the message. And well, we can only hope that the report that will be published on Monday will highlight just how much better off everyone will be if we address the climate crisis properly.
Yeah, thank you so much. You just mentioned it. And I love the fact when you said we need more scientists from Africa to see how they can also participate in all of these processes and bringing out solutions and where the problems also lies. And very well. And, you know, in every vulnerability of climate change, there is always a loss and damage to deal with. And for that of Madagascar and the rest of African countries that have been impacted by cyclone on different occasions, you know, it's a very total disaster to deal with. And I totally agree with you that we need to keep, we need to walk the talk, you know. If every commitment that have been made in Glasgow COP26 and other climate summit has become a reality, will not be here, because for every IPCC report, it reminds us that we all have a responsibility. It reminds us that we have a lot of work to do in order for us to be able to win the race against the climate crisis. So I just want to ask, just like a concluding part of this, that what do you have to say about the IPCC report, about young people trying to champion solutions, trying to come out to demand for a better future and the rest? What is your concluding part when it comes to IPCC reports, this latest report? What action do you think we need to take? What do you think we need to do? What are your advice for young people like me that is taking action and the rest?
So as I said before, I think for people, for young people, the most important thing that you can do is help educate people about climate change. Because many of us, and especially those in decision-making positions in the world, still completely underestimate just how much climate change costs. And I don't talk just about economic costs, but also what we lose in terms of ecosystems and cultural heritage. And I think education and educating ourselves and our peers, but then also wherever we can, talking about climate change and holding everyone we work with and everyone that are in the spheres where we have some influence to account and ask what they are doing. I think that's the most powerful and most important thing that we can do. And I think it's also, we see that it's working. It's working too slow at the moment, but it is working. Things are changing, and people at least are now talking about climate change, and every company in the world has now a climate change plan. They are not enough. They are very far from enough, but it is an important step in the right direction.
Okay, thank you so much. And just a little, just one question for me to ask you. That what do you think about leaders that talks about climate promise of 2030, 2050, 2060 in this kind of scenario now that the climate change crisis is happening? What do you have to say about those kind of commitments that are not addressing the current crisis, but rather it's a long, very long-term solution that they are bringing on board, which we are not very sure of how impactful is going to look like of 2030, 2040, 2060, 2070. What is your own contribution of your perspective?
So I think you can immediately, you can identify a credible climate policy by how concrete it is. So if there are no concrete steps and concrete measures that are implemented now in this year and next year, then it's just words. So I think that is every climate goal and every climate strategy needs to have very concrete plans for now, and not for the next, only starting in 30 years when they are not in power anymore. So that is really what we need. We need to act now, and we need to hold our leaders accountable to acting now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presence, your time, value every part of it right here, because you have been able to contribute. I know you have been participating in different processes of this, and your knowledge you shared today, I know is going to help the audience to be able to understand what the report is talking about, what they need to know about it, and how they can hold our leaders accountable for every bit of their commitment. Because I really don't see why we need to postpone climate action into the future, because it is now a denial for every inaction or every delay. It's now a denial against the climate change. So we need to act now and not postponing climate action into 2030, 2050s or thereabouts. That is not what we call climate promise. It's a denial. You are trying to put the next generations to take the responsibility, you know, because every leader should be able to give what his or her leadership can be able to solve, can take to solve the climate change crisis, and not pushing it to the next leadership or to the next generation to solve the problem which they never caused or which they never had or know about. So thank you so much for coming today. And I believe that this report is going to propel many people to act, and is going to demand for more action as it usually used to be. It's not just going to be a just report that we just keep hearing about. And so thank you once again for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. The world needs you. The world needs you much more than it needs me. So keep on doing what you do. Thank you.
Thank you too.